Thank you, Paul, for that friendly introduction. Thank you for this invitation. I hope I will provide you with some enlightening intellectual entertainment. I'm sure that you will be disagreeing and disappointed about some of the things I say. I'm also sure that you will be delighted and in full agreement with other things that I'm going to say. I want to talk about the advantages of small states. But before I come to the advantages of small states, I will have to say a few things about political centralization. That is the opposite of small states, because only before the background of an understanding of the tendency towards political centralization will we be able to fully understand the advantages of small states. Let me begin by giving you a definition of what a government and a state is. A government is an agency that is distinguished by two characteristics from all other agencies or institutions. The first characteristic of a government is a territorial monopolist of ultimate decision-making, of ultimate judge-making in some territory. You cannot appeal beyond the state. The state is the last institution that decides who is right or wrong in cases of conflict. And this implies also that the state is the institution that decides who is right and wrong in cases of conflict that the state itself has provoked or caused. That makes you immediately aware of the fact that the state is a dangerous type of institution. If you can decide who is right and wrong in cases of conflict, even in conflicts that you have caused yourself, then it should be obvious how powerful you are, how much our liberty is threatened by the existence of an institution such as this. The second defining characteristic of a state is that the state is the only agency that can acquire its income by taxes. That is, without the consent of those people who have to pay. All firms depend on consumers buying or not buying the products that they offer in the market. A state, in contrast, does not have to rely on consent. It can unilaterally determine what people have to pay him. This again makes it clear why states are dangerous institutions. Taxes must first be produced by some productive individuals before they can be taken away. And taxes are always a punishment, so to speak, of productive individuals. But I do not want to concentrate on this aspect of states, but instead on another one that has to do with centralization. You can understand that institutions such as a state that can set their own laws and can tax people are always under the threat that people who live in the state territory might leave the state territory. People do not like to be taxed. They do what is called exit. they leave the territory for better pastures. It is like a milk cow that runs away from those who milk it too hard and tries to find some place where life is more comfortable. People leaving a state, of course, pose a threat to the state. The state does not like to see people leave, especially not the most productive individuals leave. And because states do not like to see this happening, and it does happen, states get into conflict with other states. Because states can finance their aggressive activities by imposing the cost of aggression on other people, make other people pay for their own aggressive activities, states tend to be more warlike than, let's say, firms or normal people. And so we get, because of the problem of exit, wars breaking out between different states. States try to expand their territory in order to enlarge their tax base. And the competition between states is different than the competition between firms. Economic firms can coexist in principle until the end of times. There is no reason to assume that Ford must be eventually outcompeted by General Motors, or General Motors must be outcompeted by Ford. But you can, in any given territory, only have one monopolist of taxation and ultimate decision-making. Because of this, the competition between different states is an eliminative competition. One state will, in the course of wars or other types of conflicts, eliminate the other state, and the number of states will gradually diminish until, at the logical endpoint of this process, we would have, so to speak, a world state come into existence. When we ask the question, who will be successful in this process of political centralization, that is, eliminating smaller states, expanding its territory, establishing hegemonic relationships over other smaller states, and possibly developing all the way toward a world state, who will be more successful in these warlike encounters? When we assume that states are initially of roughly the same size and have roughly the same population size, then we can say that those states that tend to be more liberal, that is, that tend to be nicer to their population, that is, they tax them less and they regulate them less, that those states will tend to be more successful in wars and eliminate states that are less liberal and regulate their population more, for the following reason. In war, you also need a productive population. You need people staying busy, producing ammunition, weapons, and so forth. Only those states that have a productive population will have the economic potential to win a drawn-out, long conflict with other states. That does not mean that sometimes in a surprise attack, a state that is less liberal and more oppressive, so to speak, can win against a state that is more liberal. But the general tendency is states that leaves their population alone, pretty much keep them productive, that those states will come out on top in these conflicts. Now this makes us understand certain obvious historical phenomena. For instance, that Great Britain was the first world power and imperial power. Great Britain had relatively low taxes, lower taxes than most other European countries, and because of that turned out to be more successful than other countries in expanding its territories, acquiring more and more colonies and so forth. But in the second half of the 19th century, Britain turned increasingly towards socialistic policies, and these socialistic policies, high taxation, high regulation, of course, led to impoverishment, to relative impoverishment of Britain, and ultimately resulted in a decline of the dominant role that Great Britain played. On the other hand, parallel to the decline of Great Britain, we can see the rise of the United States to the sole world power. At the beginning of the 19th century, the United States had less population than most of the larger European states, but had almost no taxation whatsoever. Because of that, it developed very quickly. Standards of living increased rapidly. The population increased rapidly. At the end of the 19th century, the United States was larger and economically more powerful than any of the European countries. And based on this position, then the United States determined decisively, so to speak, the outcome of World War I, and then of World War II, and then of the Cold War, and remained as the only economic superpower. But the larger states become, in the case of Great Britain and in the case of the United States also, the larger the territories become, the more they begin to dominate the world. Europe, in a way, is a region that is to a large extent controlled by the United States, as indicated, for instance, by the fact that there are American troops in most, though not in all, European countries. The larger the territories become, the less reason remains for states to keep up their initial liberal policies. The more likely does it become that they give in to the temptation that exists for all states, namely to increase the taxes higher and higher and higher, and to increase regulations to the advantage of the state and state-connected enterprises higher and higher and higher, and thereby stifling the economy. Let me just illustrate that by pointing out that at the beginning of the United States entering the world scene, state expenditures as a percentage of gross national product in the United States were about 3 to 5%. And in European countries, they were around 10, 12%. Now, since the 70s or so, they are in the European countries 50% or even above 50%. In the United States, they have reached 40%. So as a result of centralization, the elimination of competition between different states, the increasing elimination of competition between different states, you have a tendency for taxes and regulations to dramatically increase. You have, and you see this in the European community, and you see that in the United States, you have an attempt to harmonize and upward harmonize the regulation and tax structure in different countries, in the countries that are all dominated by the same superpower. If one country has one tax and another country has another tax, then political integration is that both countries adopt both taxes. If one country has one type of regulation and another country has another type of regulation, then the tendency of political centralization is that both countries adopt both types of regulation. We have no longer free trade relationships between small states, but we have increasingly managed trade in these super blocks like the European Community or in the North American free trade arrangement. You realize this when you recognize that in order to engage in free trade, you only need 2 sentences. Everyone who wants to import a good from some other place is free to do so, and everyone who wants to export a good from one place to another is also free to do that. If you look, however, at the rules and regulations of the European Community, you find that they make up tens of thousands of pages. And you ask yourself, what has such a thing to do with free trade if you need tens of thousands of pages to describe it? The North American Free Trade Agreement has also nothing to do with free trade between Canada and Mexico and the United States. That is also a document that encompasses more than 1,500 pages, and that again indicates that this is a document that proscribes all sorts of rules that various enterprises have to follow, that gives certain advantages to government-connected firms and disadvantages small firms that have no power to lobby their own governments. Further, when we have a tendency towards political centralization, as we see it going on in the European Community and see it also going on the North American continent, the central states, again, coming, so to speak, from the United States, but also imitated, of course, by the European states, modeling themselves after the American model. We have a tendency that in order to promote the centralization, you have to destroy all regional identities. You have to advocate a policy of of multiculturalism, through a policy of open immigration, which leads, of course, to the gradual destruction of regional and local identities which stand in the way of the attempts of states to centralize their powers. Now let me, before I come to the topic of the advantages of small states, which I have indicated at least indirectly, let me also say a few words about monetary centralization, because we observe something similar in the area of money that we observe in the area of territorial centralization. Money is something that develops quite naturally in the free market, because there exists in barter difficulties to trade with each other. I can only trade with you if I have what you want and you have what I want. And this is not always the case. And in order to overcome this difficulty, people are looking out for goods that are highly marketable, that is, that are in frequent use by lots of people, because highly marketable goods facilitate exchange. And there exists a natural tendency that one particular good, we cannot say exactly what good that will be, but we can say that there's a tendency that some good will be selected as the good that has the highest degree of marketability, that is, the most easily saleable good. And this good we call money. Money is defined as a medium of exchange that has the highest degree of salability. In reality, as we know, this was gold or silver. Being the owner of gold or silver allowed us to sell at any time whatever we wanted to sell, and to buy at any time whatever we wanted to buy. It facilitated exchange. Money was originally what is called a commodity money, something that had an intrinsic value. All states have destroyed the commodity money. All states have succeeded in replacing gold and silver with pure paper monies. How they did that? They did that in 3 steps. All states took the same 3 steps. Some states did that earlier, some states did that later, but all went basically through the same process. The first step was, states said, I'm the only one who can mint gold or silver and certify the weight and the fineness of money. But as we all know, monopoly, being the only one who does a certain thing, makes it easier to engage in fraudulent activities. That is, to reduce the gold content and the silver content. The second step was to monopolize the issue of what is called money substitutes. Money substitutes are simply paper tickets that entitle you to a certain quantity of money, of gold or silver. If you monopolize the issue of money substitutes, of paper tickets, then you are in a position where you can relatively easy print more tickets than you have gold or silver on hand into which to redeem these tickets. That is, to cause inflation. And the third step is, once people begin to redeem their tickets, and states must admit that they do not have sufficient amounts of gold or silver on hand in order to redeem all tickets, they must essentially declare bankruptcy and cut the tie between paper and gold and silver, and then we have a pure paper money. Now, the advantage from the point of view of a state of a pure paper money is a pure paper money can, of course, be produced at will. I can, in 1 day or 2 days, double, triple the amount of money in existence. I could never do anything like this under the gold standard or under the silver standard. Now, what is the effect of doubling or tripling the amount of money in existence? What we must realize is doubling the amount of money has nothing to do with making societies richer, wealthier. If you assume that the amount of consumer goods and producer goods stays the same, and we double the amount of money from 1 day to the next, all that will happen is basically that prices will double. Society as a whole does not become richer because of this. But doubling the supply of money does something else. It redistributes income within society. It makes some people richer and it makes some people poorer, even though it does not make society as a whole richer. And what the way is in which income and wealth is redistributed is the following. Those people who get the new money first, the additional amounts of paper money first, and you all know who that is. That is always the central bank, and then the leading commercial banks, and then the leading clients of the leading commercial banks. They are always the ones who receive the money first. Those are in a position where they can buy at the initially low prices, and then the prices gradually rise, and they gain at the expense of those people whose income has not gone up yet, but who have to pay higher prices for the goods. So, in short, what an increase in the amount of money does, what it does for a state to control the supply of money, to have a paper money, is it redistributes wealth and income in the favor of the state and its clientele, and at the expense of all those people who get this new money very late in the game. That is basically you and me. This is why all states love to be in full control of the supply of paper money. However, if you have different countries that are all on a paper money standard, then if one country prints more paper tickets than another country, then its currency will fall in the currency market against other currencies. And no country likes to see it, that it has a permanent tendency that its own currency permanently falls against other currencies. What is the solution from the point of view of governments to this problem? That is, I cannot inflate as much as I want, because then my currency will fall in the currency market against the currency of other countries. The solution is to create currencies such as the euro that reduce the competition between different paper monies. And ultimately, of course, to create a world paper money, because this world paper money issued by a world central bank can, by definition, no longer fall against any other paper currency, because there is no other paper currency anymore. That is, in the monetary arena, the worst thing that we can possibly imagine in terms of inflation would be a world central bank issuing a world paper currency. And the euro is a decisive step in this direction. The euro is a currency that is more inflationary than the least inflationary currency was that existed before, like the German mark, for instance. It is an attempt to eliminate the barriers that existed before for causing inflation and enriching the state. So monetary centralization is also something very bad. Now I come to the advantages of small states, drawing, so to speak, the conclusion from the description of the disadvantages of centralization, political centralization, and monetary centralization. First, it is important to recognize that historians are by and large agreed on the explanation why it is that Europe became the wealthiest region in the world as compared to, let's say, China and other developed parts of the world. They are generally agreed on the fact that Europe reached this dominant position because Europe, in contrast, for instance, to China, was highly decentralized. Europe was a political anarchy, consisting at some times of thousands of independent political units, of free cities, very small states, and so forth. And again, recall in what respect this is an advantage. Very small states are faced with the problem of exit. People just simply leave if they are not treated well and go someplace else. On the other hand, if you have a world state, then you have all over the world the same tax and regulation structure. Wherever you go, the same tax and regulation structure applies. There's no reason for anyone to ever go from one place to another, and because of that, there's no longer any danger for a state that people simply leave because the state becomes too oppressive. So Europe owes its unique wealth to the fact that it was a political anarchy with a tremendous amount of political competition between small units. What follows from this is, of course, that what one should ask for is to again establish a Europe that consists of thousands of Liechtensteins and Monacos and Andorras and San Marinos and places like Hong Kong and Singapore and small Swiss cantons and so forth. If you have a small state, as I explained, this small state must engage in liberal domestic policies. Otherwise, people will simply leave the state. Large states can get away with high tax policies. Small states will be finished very quickly if they engage in high tax policies. Small states must engage in free trade. They cannot engage in protectionist measures. Just imagine a place like Monaco or Liechtenstein deciding that I will no longer trade with the rest of the world. I will engage in self-sufficient production. We make trade with the rest of the world extremely difficult. Now, what you can predict in this case is, of course, that the population in Monaco will be starving very quickly, and in a few days, or at least in a few weeks, you will have people dying from starvation. On the other hand, imagine a state like the United States or the European community as a whole saying we will have no longer trade with anybody outside the United States or outside of the European community. Now, then the standard of living in the United States or in Europe would of course decline. But people would not starve in the streets. People would not die en masse. So, again, the advantage of small states is they see very quickly when they engage in unproductive economic policies. They must engage in free trade, otherwise they will be severely punished for it. Further, small states eliminate what we can describe as forced integration that we have in all large centralized states, in the United States and in the European community. What I mean by forced integration is the result of mass immigration that we have allowed to take place in order to destroy regional identities which stand in the way of the ambitions of states to centralize. Forced integration, creating multicultural societies, does not lead to peaceful relationships. It leads to unnecessary conflict. People like to associate because they are similar. And they engage in free trade with people who are different. But to be forced to live next door to people who are very different from oneself and who are unwilling to assimilate usually causes a tremendous amount of conflict. And small states, of course, have the possibility to have their own admission standards. They can determine this is the type of people that we would like to join us, and this is the type of people that we would not like to join us. Small states would be forced to be very careful in this. You realize if small numbers come to your place, you can assimilate small numbers of strangers, of foreigners, of people who are different. They have to learn the language of the place where they like to live. If people come in large numbers, then there is no need anymore to assimilate. Then you can form ghettos and maintain your own culture and religion within your own societies. And this is what we see in the United States happening. And this is what we see in Europe happening, that the numbers of immigrants coming is so overwhelming that we are no longer able to successfully assimilate these people. They are not willing to become like those where they want to live, which one would think is a perfect normal thing. They insist that they can maintain their own cultures, their own way of life in completely different societies and expect that we find this just marvelous and beautiful and all the rest of it, which of course most people do not find at all. So small states have a tremendous advantage in this regard also. Let me make an additional point connected with this. There is a danger, a real danger, that all welfare states that we have in Europe and increasingly also in the United States will eventually collapse financially because they cannot pay the pensions that they promised the elderly. They cannot pay the health care provisions that they allow people. That is, they will be bankrupt in a similar way as communism 15 years ago showed itself to be a bankrupt system. When the European states will become bankrupt, then we can expect that severe social conflicts will break out. And severe social conflicts will become particularly dramatic if you have multicultural societies. Then you will quickly have civil war on hand, because the lines of these conflicts over scarce resources will then form along ethnic, linguistic, or religious lines. So again, if you want to prevent potential civil war, then again, it seems that small states are the best way to do this. Finally, small states, and this brings me to my point that I made about monetary centralization. Small states can no longer insist, the larger the number is, can no longer insist, I have my own paper money, you have your own paper money, third state has his own paper money, and so forth. That makes trade almost impossible if we have thousands of different paper monies. Small states would be forced again to adopt an international commodity money standard such as we had in the 19th century, namely an international gold standard or international silver standard or something of that nature, and would make it impossible for states to engage in deliberate inflationary policies. Let me to summarize some of these things and also to expand a little bit, read you a wonderful quote from Johann Wolfgang Goethe, who was interviewed by one of his fans in 1828, that is at a time when Germany consisted still of 39 independent states, what he thought about German unity. And Goethe said, I do not fear that Germany will not be united. She is united, because the German thaler and groschen have the same value throughout the entire empire, and because my suitcase can pass through all 36 states without being opened. Germany is united in the areas of weights and measures, trade and migration, and 100 similar things. One is mistaken, however, if one thinks that Germany's unity should be expressed in the form of one large capital city, and that this great city might benefit the masses in the same way that it might benefit the development of a few outstanding individuals. A thoughtful Frenchman, I believe Dopin, has drawn up a map regarding the state of culture in France, indicating the higher or lower level of enlightenment of its various départements by lighter or darker colors. There we find, especially in the southern provinces, far away from the capital, some départements painted entirely in black, indicating a complete cultural darkness. Would this be the case if the beautiful France had 10 centers instead of just one, from which light and life radiated? What makes Germany great is her admirable popular culture, which has penetrated all parts of the empire evenly. And it is not the many is it not the many different princely residences from whence this culture springs, and which are the bearers and curators? Just assume that for centuries only the two capitals of Vienna and Berlin had existed in Germany, or even only a single one. Then I'm wondering what would have happened to the German culture and the widespread prosperity that goes hand in hand with culture. Germany has 20 universities strewn out across the entire empire, more than 100 public libraries, and a similar number of art collections and natural museums. For every prince wanted to attract such beauty and good. Gymnasia and technical and industrial schools exist in abundance. Indeed, there is hardly a German village without its own school. How is it in this regard in France? Furthermore, look at the number of German theaters, which exceeds 70. The appreciation of music and song and their performance is nowhere as prevalent as in Germany. Then think about cities such as Dresden, Munich, Stuttgart, Kassel, Braunschweig, Hanover, and similar ones. Think about the energy that these cities represent. Think about the effects they have on neighboring provinces, and ask yourself if all of this would exist if such cities had not been the residences of princes for a long time. Frankfurt, Bremen, Hamburg, Lübeck are large and brilliant, and their impact on the prosperity of Germany is incalculable. Yet, would they remain what they are if they were to lose their independence and be incorporated as provincial cities into one great German empire? I have reason to doubt that. And I think Goethe, again, recall, this is in 1828. I tend to agree completely with Goethe. It was precisely this anarchic structure that existed in Germany that was responsible for the fact that Germany became, in Europe, the leading scientific and cultural country in Europe, far outpassing a country like France that had been centralized with all cultural life taking place in Paris. And I think the decline of German cultural life begins in 1871 with the unification of Germany. Of course, it takes a few generations before the decline becomes really apparent. But the fact that Germany was split up in many places was responsible for the fact that they had a large number of very excellent universities, whereas in France, of course, you had just one excellent university. The same applies by and large to the unification of Italy. I think that was also a big mistake, which occurred in the 1860s. Italy would have also prospered more if they would have remained splintered as they were. The last remark concerns the country from which I come, the United States. There, initially, of course, we did have significant competition between the various states until the War of Southern Independence. That is what in Europe is usually referred to as the American Civil War, what people in the southern states of the United States call the War of Northern Aggression. This war created for the first time an overwhelming, mighty central state in the United States that concentrated most of the powers in its hand and made it more or less impossible for the individual states which initially constituted the United States to separate themselves from the central government. Again, in my view, this has not led to more prosperity and more cultural development taking place in the United States, but it has stifled the economic development in the United States because it has reduced competition between the individual states. The United States would have been, again, or maybe not the United States, but the same territory, would have been far wealthier than it actually is if it would have remained separated as it was before 1861. So I believe that we have overwhelming reasons to think that the future of Europe is not the European integration and the creation of a Central European state dominated in some way by the United States, and then maybe building out of this even larger political units. The future of Europe is to think back to what we had during long times of the Middle Ages, a highly decentralized Europe with many interspersed free cities, increasing the competition between political units. That is what will create prosperity and liberty and peaceful relationships between people of different ethnic and cultural background. Thank you very much.
So I thank Hans-Hermann Hoppe for a very interesting lecture, and me for myself speaking, I've learned a lot of interesting and very new things. En ik spreek ongetwijfeld niet voor mij alleen, maar u allen hebt hier ongetwijfeld heel wat van opgestoken. Graag zouden wij daar nog bij aanknopen met een vragenronde van een kwartiertje, die wij nu gaan voorbereiden. Er zal wat muziek zijn om de zeden wat te verlichten. U hebt uw antwoordkaart. Er zijn ook een aantal mensen die u een balpen kunnen aanbieden, hè? Een pen, zodoende dat u, wanneer u bij ontstenten is, wanneer u er geen hebt, alsnog uw vraag op de kaart kan krijgen. Ondertussen worden die vragenkaartjes ook opgehaald en binnen een 5 à 10-tal minuutjes hebben wij dan onze vragenronde. Kleine opmerking, wie niet dadelijk een vraag heeft, maar bijvoorbeeld wel zich wenst in te schrijven voor het colloquium, kan dat doen op de keerzijde van het kaartje. En uiteraard wachten wij dan ook met veel plezier het kaartje in. Tot zo dadelijk. My first question to you is, are you a pessimist? So, something to think about? Yeah. Goed, beste mensen. We gaan er misschien terug aan beginnen. Of niet misschien, allicht gaan we eraan beginnen. En wij nemen allemaal terug plaats. Wat ik ga doen, is een aantal vragen groeperen. Wat ik ook ga doen, is een aantal vragen stellen die specifiek zijn, maar toch representatief voor vele anderen. En u gaat dan uiteraard tijdens de receptie de gelegenheid hebben om met professor Hoppe nog van gedachten te wisselen. Dus we gaan het een kwartiertje doen, ga enkele vragen stellen en ik geef telkens het woord aan professor Hoppe om een antwoord te formuleren. De eerste vraag is of dat professor Hoppe in feite een pessimist is. Hans-Hermann Hoppe, are you a pessimist?
Yeah, so far there has been very little reason to be optimistic, I must say. Very often I feel first some major crisis has to occur before people will wake up. But sometimes crisis makes things worse than they were before. So it is very important that one has some alternative scenario and an alternative model in the back of one's mind to present when the crisis is coming, that is when the welfare state will begin to collapse. On the other hand, I must say, I do also see some encouraging signs going on. In Germany, certain topics that were for many, many years absolutely taboo have become topics that people do talk about again. Of course, I think that movements such as yours, even though I might not agree with all aspects of it, are by and large an encouraging sign. So my answer is, my feelings are somewhat mixed.
Oké, thank you. Dank u wel. De tweede vraag. Gaat dat meer in op ideologie? Gaat dat meer in op het ideologische debat dat over de plas in de Verenigde Staten en ook hier woedt? Het gaat namelijk over de vraag of libertariërs en paleoconservatieven, ongeacht hun verschillen, toch niet samen zouden moeten spannen tegen grote, breed uitgezette regeringen. Tegen regeringen met totalitaire trekjes. So in English, Hans-Hermann Hoppe, how do you see as a libertarian the growing power of the United States federal government under a presidency of a so-called conservative Republican? And shouldn't libertarians and paleoconservatives, despite their differences, combine forces against big government?
I should say a few words about paleoconservatives and libertarians. They had some sort of coalition during the 1990s. The paleoconservatives are the old-style conservatives in the United States. The most prominent person of that group is probably Pat Buchanan. It is true that culturally conservative libertarians and paleo-conservatives who advocate decentralization of governmental power to the largest extent possible, who advocate a non-interventionist foreign policy, did cooperate quite well for a while, except for one subject. And that subject was a free trade. We always tried to persuade Pat Buchanan to study a little bit economics. We asked him to read Henry Hazlitt, Economics in One Lesson, which is the book that I would recommend to everyone who has never studied anything in economics. That's the only thing you need to know about economics in order to avoid the most severe mistakes. Unfortunately, we couldn't bring Pat Buchanan to do this. And he began to emphasize more and more heavily his protectionist economic policies, and that ultimately led to some sort of break in the movement that we had begun to develop. Now, this does not mean that we are not still joined, so to speak, in our opposition against the current Bush regime, which is dominated by the so-called neoconservatives, who are mostly former social democrats and ardent interventionists as far as foreign policy is concerned. So yes, in our we still cooperate quite closely, not close enough to speak of a joint movement because of the free trade question. But again, let me emphasize that in particular those people who are in favor of small states should realize how important free trade is. As I explained, for small states not to engage in free trade is deadly. Large states can afford this with standards of living declining. Small states cannot afford anything but free trade.
So, all right, we look forward to new developments. In the first place in the United States. Wat we nu hebben gehoord, dat is een meer specifieke vraag en een specifiek antwoord. Maar nu gaan we naar een meer algemene vraag, waarvan ik vermoed dat een aantal mensen zich dat wel hebben afgevraagd in het publiek. Hoe valt het streven naar kleine staten in feite te verzoenen met de globale macht van multinationale ondernemingen, de globalisering? So next question, how can small states cope with the growing power of global multinational enterprises?
Let me put it this way. Many global enterprises, many of the super big enterprises are also creatures of the state. As you all know, whenever a big company is in difficulties, they can afford lobbyists who go to Brussels or Berlin or Washington and say, look, there will be 10,000 jobs lost, 100,000 jobs lost. You have to help us. And states then typically do help because they are helped by these firms also because they finance their campaigns. Under truly competitive conditions, that is without state intervention in the economy, many of these super conglomerates would have fallen apart into smaller units, into smaller firms. In general, however, we do not have to be afraid of large firms on principle ground. As I said, I mean, they can be creatures of the state. They must not be creatures of the state. Firms will locate at places that are favorable. If you are a place where property rights are respected, firms like that. If you are a place where taxes are low, firms will like to locate there. And in general, firms have less power than governments are. Firms cannot jail people. Firms did not outlaw the Vlaamsblok. It was the state that outlawed the Vlaamsblok. Firms must sell their products to people who can say yes or can say no. So be a little bit more afraid of what the state can do and be a little bit less afraid of what firms can do.
Okay, thank you. Huisvrouw- en keukenpraatje in Vlaanderen is, en dan hoop ik niet dat ik gedeprecieerd spreek over onze eigen arbeidsethos, maar is zwart werk. Wie werkt er zwart in de straat? Misschien mensen die men kent die wel eens iets doen en dat dan niet aangeven, tenminste het inkomen dat ze eruit verwerken. Maar goed, we zouden geen Vlamingen zijn als we niet over de taalgrens kijken en de Walen, de Franstaligen, misschien minder arbeidsethos van die mensen misschien minder arbeidsethos vermoeden en tegelijkertijd en ook het dichter aan bij zwart werk. Wellicht zijn er verschillen in arbeidsethos en er zijn er verschillen in zwart werk en in niet-officiële economie tussen staten. Van land tot land kan die attitude op een bepaalde manier tegen werk te staan anders zijn. En hoe staat men tegenover zwart werk? En iemand vroeg, en van de mensen hier uit het publiek, toehoorders, hoe dat we ons moeten verhouden tegenover de verschillen in de niet-officiële markten. So, what with differences in the unofficial markets of states? For example, in some states there is more moonlighting than in other states.
Yeah, there's the more you punish people for being productive, the more they will go underground. The best example of that is, of course, the former East Bloc, places like the Soviet Union, where people were not even permitted to own private property and could not accumulate, so to speak, private wealth. In those societies, the only thing that worked was the black market. The official economy was just a sheer disaster. You never got anything done in the official economy. If you wanted to get your car repaired, they would tell you that they don't have this screw or that screw, and that might take a few months before they get it. As soon as you just told them that you would pay in unofficial Western currency or so, they quickly found these types of screws that they otherwise couldn't find. And in the Western world, you see that also, that the heavier the tax load is that is imposed on people, the greater is the incentive that people will go underground. I think we should not, we should not blame the people who go underground. We should blame those people who are responsible for the laws that force people to do that increasingly. Imagine if you have marginal tax rates of, let's say, 90% for an income above, say, 50,000 euros. Now, in that case, of course, I would stop working once I had accumulated 50,000 euros too, and do all the rest of my work underground. And I think this is what you will find wherever you look. When the taxes are low, when the regulations are low, then people work in the official markets. And when taxes are high and regulations are high, then people go underground. And we should be thankful that they go underground, because that sometimes keeps the economy going, which otherwise would collapse.
All right, very well. Ik wil nu graag de mensen die een vraag gesteld hebben bedanken. En mensen die geen antwoord hebben gekregen, die krijgen zelf tijdens de receptiegelegenheid van professor Hoppe aan te spreken. Een laatste vraag. Een laatste vraag. Ik heb die speciaal op het einde gehouden, als laatste vraag gehouden, omdat die wat samenvattend is. Er is iemand in het publiek, en dank u voor die vraag, dat is een mooie vraag om af te sluiten. De staat met de meest grootschalige dictatuur ontwricht het economische handelssysteem en hoe dat zich toe te verhouden in de toekomst. So, our last question is summarizing your lecture and question round we had earlier. The state which is the most totalitarian state, so a totalitarian state, destroys the economic system of trade by being totalitarian. Do we have any means to cope with that evolution in the future? Is it going towards more small states?
Yeah, we do see all over the world an increasing number of secessionist movements. Wherever you look, there exist such movements. Unfortunately, most educated people still think that this is, so to speak, an anachronism. That is a way, not a progressive move, but it is somehow a desperate attempt going back. It is necessary that people begin to understand what I tried to convey tonight, that the secessionist movements and the splintering up of Europe into larger and into larger numbers of small units and many free cities interspersed into this region, that this might well be the wave of the future. That this is a better recipe for prosperity and liberty than this constant centralization that we have seen taking place for the last 50 years or so in Europe and in other parts of the world. So all governments, whether they are totalitarian or democratic, monarchical or non-monarchical, are ultimately dependent on public opinion being somewhat supportive of them. If we want a change in trends of political thinking, there is nothing else but trying to change public opinion and persuade public opinion that centralization leads to more totalitarian governments and decentralization, increasing the number of small states, leads to more liberty and makes totalitarian attempts, totalitarian governments increasingly difficult to maintain themselves. Since this was the last question, I have been asked by my friend Paul Berlin to make you aware of what has already become a hot commodity in the English book market. There are copies available outside. A Throne in Brussels, I can tell you, a thrilling book. And I might also make you aware that there are 2 copies of my book available. Unfortunately, I'm traveling with a suitcase, and by train, I couldn't carry more things with me. I'm a weak person. With that, thank you very much. People leaving a state, of course, pose a threat to the state. The state does not like to see people leave, especially not the most productive individuals leave. And because states do not like to see this happening, and it does happen, states get into conflict with other states. Because states can finance their aggressive activities by imposing the cost of aggression on other people, make other people pay for their own aggressive activities, states tend to be more warlike than, let's say, firms or normal people. And so we get, because of the problem of exit, wars breaking out between different states. States try to expand their territory in order to enlarge their tax base. And the competition between states is different than the competition between firms. Economic firms can coexist in principle until the end of times. There is no reason to assume that Ford must be eventually outcompeted by General Motors, or General Motors must be outcompeted by Ford. But you can, in any given territory, only have one monopolist of taxation and ultimate decision-making. Because of this, the competition between different states is an eliminative competition. One state will, in the course of wars or other types of conflicts, eliminate the other state, and the number of states will gradually diminish until, at the logical endpoint of this process, we would have, so to speak, a world state come into existence. When we ask the question, who will be successful in this process of political centralization, that is, eliminating smaller states, expanding its territory, establishing hegemonic relationships over other smaller states, and possibly developing all the way toward a world state? Who will be more successful in these warlike encounters? When we assume that states are initially of roughly the same size and have roughly the same population size, then we can say that those, a state, in contrast, does not have to rely on consent. It can unilaterally determine what people have to pay him. This again makes it clear why states are dangerous institutions. Taxes must first be produced by some productive individuals before they can be taken away. And taxes are always a punishment, so to speak, of productive individuals. But I do not want to concentrate on this aspect of states, but instead on another one that has to do with centralization. You can understand that institutions such as a state that can set their own laws and can tax people are always under the threat that people who live in the state territory might leave the state territory. People do not like to be taxed. They do what is called exit. They leave the territory for better pastures. It is like a milk cow that runs away from those who milk it too hard and tries to find some place where life is more comfortable. Institutions. The first characteristic of a government is the government is a territorial monopolist of ultimate decision making, of ultimate judge making in some territory. You cannot appeal beyond the state. The state is the last institution that decides who is right or wrong in cases of conflict. And this implies also that the state is the institution that decides who is right and wrong in cases of conflict that the state itself has provoked or caused. That makes you immediately aware of the fact that the state is a dangerous type of institution. If you can decide who is right and wrong in cases of conflict, even in conflicts that you have caused yourself, then it should be obvious how powerful you are, how much our liberty is threatened by the existence of an institution such as this. The second defining characteristic of a state is that the state is the only agency that can acquire its income by taxes. That is, without the consent of those people who have to pay. All firms depend on consumers buying or not buying the products that they offer in the market. Thank you, Paul, for that friendly introduction. Thank you for this invitation. I hope I will provide you with some enlightening intellectual entertainment. I'm sure that you will be disagreeing and disappointed about some of the things I say. I'm also sure that you will be delighted and in full agreement with other things that I'm going to say. I want to talk about the advantages of small states. But before I come to the advantages of small states, I will have to say a few things about political centralization. That is the opposite of small states, because only before the background of an understanding of the tendency towards political centralization will we be able to fully understand the advantages of small states. Let me begin by giving you a definition of what a government and a state is. A government is an agency that is distinguished by two characteristics from all other agencies or institutions.